are continuing Children of the Nameless with Part 7 and Chapter 14. Davriel. Davriel had used the power of the entity only once. It had been 5 years ago. By that time in his life, he'd been comfortable with his powers, and with his strange ability to walk between different planes of existence. He'd spent years traveling, exploring, learning how enormous the multiverse was. He'd suffered enslavement and found vengeance. He'd become expert at dealing with demons. He'd come to realize just how special he was. And he decided, at long last, to claim himself a throne. It had been during that struggle, a desperate, climactic clash between armies and ideologies, that he'd finally relented and drawn upon the entity. As they rode toward the bog, he let the entity control his senses. Instead of seeing the inside of the carriage, he saw himself standing on a field of corpses. Men and women in bright red lay scattered in heaps, spotted here and there with the black and gold tabards of his guard. Banners flapped in the wind, a forlorn sound. The air smelled sharply of smoke, a scent that barely covered the stench of blood. Enemies had come to crush his defending army, and so, in desperation, he'd reached for the power. Even he hadn't been prepared for the result. "I can give you everything," the entity promised. "Worlds upon worlds can be yours." It had been standing on that bloody battlefield that Davriel had first sensed others hunting him. They'd arrived on the battlefield, drawn to the plane by his use of this power, like moths to a flame. He didn't know who they were. Likely they were allies of the dying man from whose mind Davriel had originally stolen the entity. But he knew that, whoever they were, they'd hunt him through eternity for this power. They'd destroy him. And so he fled, and left the corpses of both those who had opposed him and those who had believed in him, their blood mingling on a battlefield that would know no burial. The carriage rocked, shaking Davriel out of his reverie. The memory faded, leaving him with only the feeling of having used the entity to power his spells. The sudden and awe-inspiring sense of strength that had come from touching something much, much larger than himself. He'd felt that exact emotion minutes ago, after reaching into the girl's mind. His head ached from that encounter, but the ramifications were far, far more troubling than the pain. He looked at Takenda, who sat on the seat opposite him, her legs tucked beneath her. Miss Highwater pretended to be reading a book, but he suspected from the infrequency of her page turns that she was actually watching Takenda, with good reason. "There is another of you," he thought to the entity, "and it is inside the girl." "Yes," the entity said. "Part of it is, at least. It is not fully alive. It cannot speak to her, except in the crudest of ways." "Why didn't you tell me there was another of you?" Davriel demanded. "All these years, and you never said anything." "The others should not have mattered," the entity said. "I am the strongest, but after sensing what you did, that those who hunted us would destroy you, I realized You needed more than just me. Strongest though I am, I have weaknesses. You brought me here, Davriel realized. You planted the idea in my head. You wanted me to come here, where another of you hid, so that I would take that power as well. Yes, the entity replied. This entity, like myself, is the remnant of an ancient plane. Destroyed, consumed, its power condensed. It is the soul of an entire land, you might say. The majority of its power hides in the bog. You can take it and become mighty enough that none would ever dare challenge you. You still haven't answered my question, Davriel thought with frustration. Why didn't you tell me there were two of you? I am bound to protect you, the entity said. You are my master and my host, but it was hard to admit that I must share you with another. You could still have told me. Perhaps you would have fled again. I do not understand you. To claim me, to use me, is obviously your destiny, and yet you hesitate. I can sense your ambition. I know you understand the glory that awaits you. Your delays confuse me, and so I waited for the right crisis to arrive, to make you move, act. A spike of worry struck Davriel. Are you behind this? He demanded. Did you kill the people of Varlazen? No, the entity said, but this is the moment. When you confront the bog, you will see. You will draw upon me, and together we will consume and absorb the power of the second entity. And the girl? Davriel asked. She has but a bit of the power, the entity replied. I worried at first that she held it all, but when you saw into her just now, I knew the truth. She has a fraction of the power. I do not know why, or why the souls of the people are acting as they are. Perhaps the entity of the bog senses that we are coming for it, but once we confront it and claim its power as our own, we can deal with the child. The implications of the conversation shook Davriel. Perhaps, then, he was behind all of this. Could the bog have attacked the village in order to gather its power? Was it preparing to fight Davriel? Could he truly confront and defeat an entity like the one in his mind? A rogue power. The fraction of it within the girl had been enough to blast him forcibly back. How could he win against an even greater power? You will need my help, the entity said. You will make the choice at long last. You will become a god. These people, Davriel thought, have already been failed by enough gods. A choice, the entity repeated, its voice trailing off as the carriage started to slow. Takenda perked up. At the sudden motion, Miss Highwater's hand moved, ever so slightly, toward her knife. We're here, Takenda said, opening the door before Crunchnar had time to fully stop the vehicle. Light spilled out, illuminating an old keeper's shack and a dark, watery pit. Takenda hopped down, her dress catching on underbrush as she picked her way toward the bog. Davriel stepped out once the vehicle had stopped, then rested his hand on the place where his body had smashed against the wood. He didn't relish the idea of a conflict. He was exhausted and his head pounded. The entity could heal most normal ailments, but it never removed headaches. Perhaps Davriel needed the reminder that despite it all, he really was human. Crunchnar's feet thumped against the ground as he leaped from his place atop the carriage. His body healed at an incredible rate. Already the wounds he'd taken at the church had shrunk to mere scratches, barely visible as the demon held up his lantern and bathed the area in orange light. "I knew that we'd end up here," Takenda said from closer to the bog. "I knew it somehow." She turned toward him in the shadows. "You did too, didn't you?" Davriel approached the bog, pulled as if by invisible chains. Takenda knelt beside the black pit, staring into the waters, which didn't reflect light as water should. Neither did the light penetrate. The bog seemed to somehow sit outside the scope of illumination. Spells. Davriel needed spells, but what did he have? A few minor charms? Some pyromancy that was dying away, barely strong enough to light a candle at this point? He should have prepared for months, leeching and stowing away the most powerful magic of the multiverse to confront this. "You don't need any of that," the entity said. "You have me. The power you took from the prioress can contain rogue entities, like spirits, and it will work here. With my strength powering that ability, we can contain the entity of the bog. Flee." Davriel's instincts screamed at him to run, to scramble back to his carriage and race the horses to his mansion. Or better yet, he should leave this cursed plane. Let someone else deal with the bog. Let them be heroes or tyrants. Both were virtually the same. Numbers in a table, one with a plus before it, the other a minus. And this land? What was it to him? A temporary home. He could find any number of dominions identical to it across the multiverse. He should leave it. Right here, right now. And yet, he continued forward, stepping over a fallen log to join the girl at the edge of the bog. Like a black void, a hole puncturing reality. "I knew we'd end up here," Takenda repeated. "It was our destiny." "I have no destiny," Davriel said, "save the one I make for myself." He raised his hands, gathering his power. "But your village is mine. These people are mine. It is time the bog understood who rules the approaches. Best you stand back." She didn't retreat, though Crunchnar and Miss Highwater wisely remained near the carriage. "Suit yourself," Davriel thought. He took a deep breath, then plunged his magical senses into the bog, and found it empty. Chapter 15. Davriel. I'm gonna get myself a sip of water. An entity had lived here once. Davriel could sense its remnants, like a lingering scent. The powerful force had distorted reality around it, leaving the location forever changed. But that power was gone now, empty as a tomb. "This is wrong," the entity said. "It was here. It was supposed to be here. What has happened?" "I don't know," Davriel thought, kneeling down and dipping his fingers into the water, feeling at the remnants of power. There was nothing here for him to fight. There wasn't even anything for him to steal. He looked up and expressed the prioress's talent, the ability to see where spirits had been and then anchor them. It caused him pain, another headache, but it allowed him to see a glowing green residue nearby. The Whisperers had been here. The Whisperers had been here, their trails green, like the prioress had said. And there was something else, something more ancient, a trail that led away toward Varlason village. He could distinguish it only because he was familiar with the entity inside him, and this was similar. The power had moved, left long ago, perhaps 2 decades ago, maybe a little less. The power couldn't tell him precisely. The thing that lived in the bog is gone, he said, and has been for years. What? Takenda said from beside him. Part of it is inside you, Davriel said. The entity of the bog resided here for centuries, infusing everything in the area with its scent. It seeped into your souls, like poison getting into bodies through the groundwater, and tied your people to it. So whoever has that power is controlling the Geists. This is bad, the entity said within him. I was not expecting to face a host who is trained in the power, using it to magnify their talents. We can still win, but it will be dangerous. They left me alone, Takenda said, because the Geists can sense the power of the bog inside you, Davriel said. They likely mistook you for their master. I would have thought you could control them, but for some reason your song doesn't do so. Davriel frowned as Miss Highwater approached, rustling the underbrush. So where does that leave us? She asked. Worried, Davriel said. Why would the entity leave the bog? It was afraid, Takenda whispered as she knelt beside the waters, her eyes looking glassy. Afraid? Davriel said. What could cause something so powerful to be afraid? Faith, she whispered. What? Cain, Crunchnar shouted. Davriel spun back toward the carriage, where Crunchnar had pulled out his sword. He thrust his weapon toward the roadway. We have a problem. Get over here. Davriel scrambled to the carriage, trailed by Miss Highwater. Crunchnar's lantern light didn't reach far into the night, but it didn't need to, for the Geists approaching along the road gave off a sickly green illumination. There were hundreds of them, their jaws drooping, their faces distorted and inhuman. They flowed through trees and brush, advancing with a steady gait. One disjointed figure near the front lifted its finger, pointing toward Davriel, and its mouth further extended in a silent screech. Dozens of dead eyes locked on him. Then their mouths twisted in turn as, one by one, they recognized him. That was 2 chapters, which is our usual starting point, but I think we can squeeze out one more. So, Chapter 16, Takenda. Takenda knelt near the bog. Davriel had to be wrong. She'd believed in the bog all her life. It couldn't really just be empty, could it? Takenda. The whispered voice had the sound of rustling leaves. She stared into the glassy waters and found, reflected back at her, the face of her mother, as if submerged in the inky depths. Takenda extended her hand, fingertips touching the top of the bog's surface. The water was unexpectedly warm, like blood. A hand seized her by the shoulder. Miss Highwater, her grip shockingly firm, pulled Takenda to her feet, then yanked her toward the carriage. What? Geists. They flowed through the forest. Terrible, twisted creatures, only vaguely shaped like people. And on the wind she heard their terrible whispers. Takenda gaped, freezing in place, but Miss Highwater stuffed her into the carriage. Davriel was already inside, banging on the roof and shouting for Crunchnar to get them moving. The carriage lurched into motion as the horses bolted. Trees became a blur of darkness outside the window. Takenda felt every dip and rock in the road, the carriage rattling something terrible at this speed. "Miss Highwater," Davriel shouted, "which peasant is in charge of grading this roadway? Should we happen to survive, I would like to have them flogged." "Well," Miss Highwater said, "you remember that meeting we had about tax revenue allocations for maintenance of infrastructure?" "No, but it sounds boring." Let's just compromise," Davriel said, "and agree it's Crunchnar's fault." Takenda stuck her head out the window and looked back along the roadway. Wind blew at her hair, whipping it. The Whisperers gave chase. Their phantom light rolled over tree trunks and undergrowth, obstructions that the spirits ignored. They coursed after the carriage at a remarkable speed, and even over the rattling of the carriage she heard their voices, hushed whispers overlapping one another. "These are the people of my village," she thought, trembling, "taken by some force and made into geists." Was her sister's soul among them, twisted beyond recognition? Had Willia come with the others and claimed the living of Varlazen, while Takenda played her fingers raw? "Miss Varlazen," Davriel said. Takenda pulled her head back into the carriage as Davriel picked up her viol and handed it to her. "Perhaps a song might be in order," he asked. "It doesn't work on the Whisperers," she said, taking the viol in limp hands. "That's the problem that started all of this." "They are constructs of the power you hold," Davriel shouted back. "There is an entity inside you that powers your songs. That strength should be able to control them somehow." "You said yourself that I have only a part of this power. Something stronger than me is behind this." He gritted his teeth, bracing himself as they turned a somewhat sharp corner. "Earlier," he shouted to her, "you told me that you knew what had frightened the entity of the bog. You said the word faith. Why?" "I don't know," she said. "It just felt right." "Stronger than you? Looks like Phyrexians, yeah." "That is not an acceptable answer." He braced himself again on the side of the carriage as they took a corner. This time it was an even sharper turn, and Takenda was smashed into the wood, grunting. A moment later they turned the other direction, and she slid across the seat and smashed into Miss Highwater. "That fool is going to run us into a tree at this speed," Miss Highwater said. A green light shone out the window. Takenda spotted ghostly visages in the woods, making pace with the carriage. They were fast. Crunchnar didn't have much choice. Either he took the winding turns of this forest path at dangerous speeds, or he let the geists catch them. Indeed, he'd have to speed up, as the Whisperers were... Takenda slammed into the wall as they took another corner. Davriel growled and gripped the door handle. "Too sharp," he said. "We're going to—" Something snapped underneath the carriage. The vehicle tipped. At that very moment, Davriel flung open the door. Takenda lost track of him as she felt a stomach-turning sensation. then a sudden jolt as the vehicle tipped onto its side. Takenda tumbled in the carriage, frantically trying to protect her viol. Miss Highwater slid down on top of her with a grunt. The vehicle ground against the roadway, dragged briefly on its side, dirt and underbrush spraying through the window across Takenda. At last, the carriage slid to a halt. Takenda groaned, trying to untangle herself from Miss Highwater, who was cursing softly under her breath. Outside, the horses whinnied and snorted in anxiety, and she thought she heard Crunchnar trying to calm them. Water. Miss Highwater managed to stand. Then she grabbed the doorway above them. Since the carriage had come to rest on its side, one door was down beneath them, the other above. There was no sign of Davriel, though Takenda thought she had glimpsed him leaping out of the vehicle mid-tip. Crunch some water. Let's go. Huh. Takenda groaned and checked her viol. Remarkably, the instrument was in one piece. She cradled the viol as she climbed up on the sideways seat, then, with effort, pulled herself out onto what was now the top of the carriage. She was covered in dirt, her hair a tangled mess, and Miss Highwater looked little better. Davriel had landed without any apparent injury. He stood in the center of the roadway and, with a flourish, pulled on his long cloak. He looked remarkably self-possessed as he turned around, regarding the approaching whisperers. His eyes bled a pure white, his lips drawn as if in pain, and a flash of power exploded from him. The bright flash almost blinded her in the night, and it made the whisperers slow their approach. They circled the fallen carriage, twisted faces murmuring in an agitated way. They seemed to be wary of Davriel all of a sudden. "The Prioress's power," Miss Highwater said from beside Takenda, both of them still crouched on top of the fallen carriage. "He can anchor those geists, force them to be corporeal." Ridiculous though the emotion was at a time like this, Takenda found herself angry at the Lord. It was distinctly unfair that he had been able to escape without getting tangled up or covered in dirt. How was it that this man managed to appear so composed all the time, despite being so useless? "Miss Highwater," Davriel said, turning around as the whisperers started to draw closer. "Unhook the horses and try to control them. Crunchnar, your sword will likely be required." The large demon grunted and stepped over to Davriel, eyeing the spirits. Judging from the fresh scrapes on his arm, Crunchnar had fallen when the carriage crashed. Miss Highwater did as commanded, leaping down from the carriage and making calming noises toward the horses, which were tangled in their twisted bridles. Takenda stayed in place atop the carriage, which seemed the safest spot for her. At first, the whisperers left a ring of about 20 feet between themselves and the carriage. Then one tested forward. This act seemed to give the others permission, as they broke toward Davriel en masse. Those terrible whispers accompanied them, a maddening sound, so close to being understandable. She searched those twisted faces for signs of something she recognized. If these really were her friends and neighbors, shouldn't she be able to tell? Unfortunately, the faces were so distorted, they were barely recognizable as human. Crunchnar began swinging about him like a drummer, slamming the sword down into spirit after spirit. Davriel's spell had made them physical, and the weapon disrupted them, making the bodies puff and dissolve to green smoke that pooled at the ground, rather than evaporating away. Takenda felt a hint of worry. These were the souls of people she loved. Would these attacks hurt them permanently? Hopefully, the fact that the smoke pooled on the ground and lingered indicated that they weren't being destroyed completely. Miss Highwater frantically cut the horses free of their tangled harnesses. Davriel held his hand to the side to summon a weapon. The viol disappeared from Takenda's hands. She yelped in surprise as it reformed in Davriel's outstretched hand, which he then thrust toward a spirit. Halfway through the maneuver, he seemed to realize he wasn't holding a sword. He froze, then shot Takenda a withering look, as if it were somehow her fault that he'd touched her viol earlier. He tossed the viol aside, causing her to cry out atop the carriage. But then she gasped as Davriel, surrounded by glowing green figures. They clawed at him, but instead of marring his skin, their fingers sank into his face. He went rigid, others holding his arms and his cloak. Horrified, Takenda watched as a green light began to bleed from Davriel's face. They're trying to pull his soul from his body. For a moment, she was back in the village, screaming into the second darkness and the terrible whispering, listening as the people she loved were taken one at a time, listening as... No. Takenda threw herself off the top of the carriage and landed on the soft earth beside the road. She had no weapon other than her voice, so she started belting out the warning song. Crunchnar roared in pain, but the whisperers, as always, ignored it. Frustrated, she stopped singing and instead seized a sharp stone from the ground. She used it as a bludgeon, slamming into the back of a glowing green figure, trying frantically to fight her way to Davriel. She had little effect. The spirits didn't even seem to notice her there. Oh, his soul looks like Watsy has a self-insert. Not him too, she thought. He's the only hope I have. She filled the spirit in front of her, its form melting away to dark green smoke, but others pressed in, and the whisperers surrounded her. She thrashed, trying to fight through, and again she felt hopeless. The spirits didn't attack her, but they would take everyone around her, everyone she'd ever loved or even come to know, leaving her alone in the infinite, pure blackness. A blast of light washed over her, a blue wall of force, dissolving spirits in a ring. She stumbled to a stop, rock clutched in her fingertips, to find Davriel crouching at the center. He stood up, blue smoke coloring his eyes. As another spirit came in, its head at a crooked angle, its gaping mouth as long as its forearm, Davriel raised his hand and released a blast of blue light. "How?" Takenda said. "I saw them take your soul." "The ward I took from your mind acted as a shield for my soul once I activated it," he said. Though his voice was calm, his face had gone pale and he was shaking. That done, it was a simple matter to use the dismissal spell I'd taken from those hunters. He wiped his brow with a trembling hand. "You were worried for me? Foolish child. I was, of course, never in any danger." He glanced down toward the flowing green smoke. A head stretched from it, with a twisted, too wide grin. Hands reached up, reforming. "Hellfire," he said, sending out a ring of blue light as he dismissed the spirits again. This flash seemed smaller than his previous uses, and the Geists almost immediately started reforming from the ground. "Useless idiot hunters," Davriel cursed. "I've seen devils with more efficient magic. Go, get to the horses." He shoved Takenda toward the carriage, and she moved up beside the vehicle, pressing her back to it as Davriel sent a blast of light to aid Crunchnar. The tall demon had no soul to lose, and the spirits weren't pulling green light from him, but they were clawing at him, scratching his arms and trying to force him down to the ground. Davriel's blasts incapacitated many of the Whisperers, though stragglers were floating in from the forest. Takenda started, realizing that a few of these had stopped at the edge of the roadway, where they were looking at her. Two long heads twisted in strange angles on their shoulders as they regarded her. Then one raised its hand, pointing. She felt a tremor inside. These newcomers were able to see her? What had changed? "Davriel," she shouted, backing along the fallen carriage near the wheels. "Miss Highwater!" She held out her rock in a threatening manner. The Geists stopped in place. They were frightened of her rock? No. It was the necklace she'd wrapped around her wrist earlier. The Geists stared at it. While three just stood there, the last one changed, the eyes shrinking toward more normal human sizes. Its quivering form stabilized, and the face almost became human, recognizable. It backed away, putting its hands to its face. Miss Highwater leaped between Takenda and the Geists, slamming her knife into the side of a spirit's head, causing it to stumble and start to disintegrate. She pulled Takenda toward a skittish horse with a simple bridle cut from the carriage harness. "On," Miss Highwater said. "You can ride?" "Yes, my father taught me, in the evening after less storytelling, more getting the hell out of here. Dav, we're ready." He emerged from the other side of the fallen carriage, looking somewhat haggard as he blasted the pair of Geists who had been looking at Takenda. The one whose face had momentarily started to reform wasn't among those. It had trailed away into the forest. She could pick out its green light, moving among the trees. Crunchnar, bleeding from cuts along his arms, heaved himself onto a horse's back and kicked the poor thing forward. The animal held him, barely. Miss Highwater held the reins of another horse for Davriel as he prepared to climb onto its back. "Davriel," Takenda said, leaving her horse and grabbing his arm. "Something is odd about one of those spirits." "Which one?" he said immediately, scanning the area. His spell and Crunchnar's sword had left most of the Whisperers formless, but the coating of green smoke on the ground trembled, hands and faces reforming. Takenda pointed out into the forest. "A group of them came after me, the only ones who have ever tried to attack me. But when they saw the symbol of the Nameless Angel, they stopped. One ran out into the forest." Davriel frowned. "Miss Highwater, keep the horses ready. I'll return shortly." He then strode out into the forest. Takenda hesitated, then ran after him. "What?" Miss Highwater screamed after them. "Are you insane?" Moving through the forest at night was difficult. Moving through the forest at night was difficult. There always seemed to be some unseen branch clawing at her dress, or some pitfall where the ground was a foot below where she expected it. The first darkness soon surrounded them, but Davriel summoned a light in the form of a small flame from his finger. the last remaining bit of his pyromancy. She kept up with him, chasing down the glowing green light, which had stopped moving. They came upon the Geist, who knelt beside a tree, head bowed. It had started to fuzz again, its shape distorting. "The symbol," Davriel said, waving his free hand toward Takenda. She unwrapped Willia's necklace from her wrist and handed it to him. Davriel stepped around the Geist and presented it. The thing looked up, fixated on the symbol, the shape of spreading wings. "Is it the power of the Church?" Takenda asked. "No," Davriel said. "It's the power of familiarity. Remember what I told you? Spirits such as these can sometimes be recovered through a reminder of something they knew in life." The Geist reached out reverent fingers and touched the symbol of the Nameless Angel. The face faded from monstrous to human, agonized human. Though it could shed no tears, this thing was weeping. It was Rom. The old hunter-turned-gardener was a Geist now? But how? He wasn't from the village. "What?" Rom's spirit whispered. "What have you done to me, my lord?" "What do you remember?" Davriel said, voice soft, even kindly. "The last thing you recall." "I saw you off into the night," the spirit said. "I was tired and returned to my room to sleep. I couldn't, like usual, remembering all those I've killed." The glowing spirit blinked, then looked toward his hands. "Oh, Angel, I thought I'd find peace here, but no, never peace." "Why is a priest a whisperer?" Takenda said. "What is happening?" "The Priory has been attacked since we left," Davriel said. "The souls of the priests made into Geists. I worry that whoever is behind this realized that the spirits of your village wouldn't harm you, so they have begun seeking the souls of people untouched by the bog." He dropped the symbol. Apparently, the angel was no help to them. "I saw her," Rom whispered, "when I first got here. That's why they asked me to come. She'd gone mad like the others." The spirit bowed its head, weeping softly. "Rom," Davriel said, "something happened a little under 20 years ago at the bog. The entity within it fled for some reason." 20 years ago, Rom said. "I wasn't even here then. I was killing demons." "Davriel," Takenda said, "a little under 20 years? We know something that happened 15 years ago." She gestured to herself. "I was born." Davriel frowned at the words, then glanced back toward the road, where the army of spirits had reformed. They were now flowing out into the woods. "Come." He quickly started through the underbrush, away from the Geists. She reached toward Rom, but the quivering spirit was beginning to distort again, muttering about his murders. Feeling a chill, Takenda scrambled after Davriel. She pushed through the underbrush, stumbling, practically on hands and knees. "Your warding power isn't simply the strongest it's been in generations," Davriel said. "The entity of the bog moved into you and your sister. What was left of it, at least. It was afraid, perhaps being whittled away by something." "The church," Takenda said, grunting as she pulled herself over a log. "Don't you see? The prioress arrived some 2 decades ago, and the priests arrived in force. Souls began being converted, and they gave themselves to the angel instead of the bog. The Sealant Stone." The sealing stone is a trinket with a fifth-rate glamour charm on it, Davriel said. Good only for wowing peasants. It steals souls, but otherwise... He stopped in the forest, just ahead of her. She looked over her shoulder, feeling cold as the green light of approaching geists flowed toward them. You told me, Takenda said, that the bog's power had seeped into the souls of the people here. What would have happened to the power when the people died? I'd guess that normally it would have returned to the bog. Unless some device, some magical trinket was collecting those souls instead. Might it have begun gathering the strength of the bog, siphoning it off, so the strength of the entity in the bog shrank, until it grew desperate enough to try something new, to pull the rest of itself out and seek a host. 2 hosts, Davriel said. By accident, it sought the womb, a child being born, but ended up split between twin sisters. Whoever is behind this must have realized the source of your power and killed your sister for her half. But it couldn't touch you. Why? Behind, the spirits coursed around the kneeling Ram, who held the symbol of the Nameless angel in his fingers. Takenda thought she saw him drop the necklace and rise, his face distorting fully. Come, Davriel said, pulling her along with him. They emerged into open air, reaching the roadway. It wove a winding course here, and they cut through the forest to emerge into another section of it. We should return to the mansion, Davriel said. The power, Takenda said. The rest of this entity that lives inside me, it's at the priory, inside the stone. It was at the priory. Someone has obviously claimed it. His expression darkened in the moonlight. I swear, if I've somehow been played by the prioress after all. Takenda glanced back at the forest. Those spirits were coming faster and faster. They're speeding up, she said. We have to try to outrun them. Miss Varlazen, he said, aghast. Run? Me? She took him by the arm, but he remained steady. What was he waiting for? As she was about to begin running along the road, she heard the beating of hooves. A moment later, Miss Highwater tore around the curve up ahead, riding bareback on one of the horses. Visible by the light of the lantern she carried in one hand, she appeared to have slit her skirt up and back for riding. She led 2 other horses behind her in a rope, and was trailed by Crunchnar on his beleaguered animal, which seemed a pony by comparison. Miss Highwater pulled her horse to a skittish halt near Davriel. Excellent timing, he said, and with proper flair, too. I'm charging you for the skirt, she said. You're lucky we rode off to try to intercept you on the other side here. Crunchnar wanted to wait like you'd ordered. Takenda eagerly scrambled up onto one of the horses, taking little notice of the lack of a saddle. What made you decide to come for us instead? If my years of service have taught me one thing, Miss Highwater said, it's to never count on Davriel to be on time for an appointment without my help. She turned her horse, fighting to keep the feisty beast under control. She appeared to have picked up the most difficult of animals for herself. Davriel's stately black mare stood placidly as he hauled himself up. On toward the mansion, Miss Highwater said, nodding along the road in the direction opposite the spirits, who were beginning to flood out of the forest. No, Davriel said. He took a deep breath. Back the way we came, to the priory. But he kicked his horse forward, straight toward the mass of geists, and Takenda joined him. Miss Highwater cursed loudly, but then followed, as did Crunchnar, whose horse was making an incredible effort to not collapse under his bulk. As they reached the spirits, Davriel let out a blast of blue light. This time, it made only the very closest of the spirits disintegrate. Fortunately, the others did waver for a moment, as if stunned. Takenda and the others entered the mass. She was sure she felt the touch of ghostly fingers brush the skin of her legs. Their ice seemed to reach her very core, chilling a part of her that hitherto had always known only warmth. Then she was out of it, Davriel clinging to her horse. She didn't have to do much. She gave the beast free rein and tried to hang on with her knees. It had taken well over an hour for them to reach the bog from the priory, but they'd stopped for Davriel's nap during that, and had ridden the rest of the way at a leisurely carriage pace. Their return took a fraction of the time. The ride worked each poor horse into a lather, but never once did Takenda have to urge her mount forward. The whispering spirits chased them the whole way, and it seemed that, no matter how hard the horses ran, the Geists were always just behind, flowing through the forest, staying out of reach, to the point that Takenda worried she was being herded in this direction. They eventually galloped from the forest onto the priory grounds. The suddenly open sky presented a field of stars. The moon had begun to set. That struck a sudden note of terror within Takenda. She looked over her shoulder, past the ghosts, toward the eastern sky. The horizon was obscured by trees as always, but she did see a faint glow, heralding dawn. They'd been about their investigation all night. Soon, when the sun rose, Takenda would become blind again. She turned back around, trying to wrestle control of her horse as they neared the priory. Only then did she notice that all of the windows were dark. The bonfires and lanterns at the perimeter had gone out, and not a single candle seemed lit anywhere in the building. Miss Highwater got her horse to stop, then climbed down. Davriel didn't bother with any of that. He just stepped off the horse and hit the ground, skidding to a halt. How in Avacyn's name did he manage that without tripping? Takenda was far less skillful, as she accidentally made her horse rear as it pulled up. She slipped off at a half-intentional attempt at dismounting, and hit the soft ground in a heap. Crunchnar arrived last of all, his horse barely at a trot. He stepped free, grumbling quietly about his hatred of horses, though the poor animal had been the one to suffer. It, like the others, took off in a sweaty canter as the glowing line of spirits coursed out of the forest. Instead of advancing, the whisperers spread out, making a ring around the clearing. "We're going to be trapped here," Takenda thought. "Have I led us to our deaths?" Davriel let the horses go without a second glance. Perhaps he knew that after such a hard ride, they'd be too exhausted to carry riders further. The poor animals would be lucky if they survived the night. As will we, Takenda thought. Water time. Crunchnar led the way into the priory, sword out, carefully checking one way, then the other. Davriel followed, then Miss Highwater with their single lantern. The hallway was dark, empty, but two corpses lay just inside. Church guards, fallen where they had stood, eyes open and mouths frozen mid-scream. They looked just like the first victims of the Whisperers that the village had found. Davriel nodded to the right, and Crunchnar led the way, stepping with a silence that seemed at odds with his stature. Miss Highwater slipped a few half-melted candles off a windowsill, then lit them on the lantern. Takenda took one, though the quivering light it provided seemed a frail thing. They passed a couple more bodies, servant youths who were priests in training, though most here had probably been in bed when they'd been taken. Takenda's heart thundered in her ears, and she felt anxious at walking so slowly after their rush to arrive. A glance out the window showed the Geists approaching the priory, surrounding it in an increasingly tighter ring. Crunchnar reached the point in the hallway where Davriel's disturbing runes covered the walls, then eased open the door to the prioress's office. They found the elderly woman's body slumped at the desk, frozen like the others. Davriel cursed softly. "It might have been easier if she were behind it," he said, "as I leached her powers away earlier." Takenda shivered, looking around the darkened hallway. Would the soldiers here have been able to fight back if Davriel hadn't stolen the prioress's abilities? "What now?" Miss Highwater said. As if in response to her question, a faint vibration struck the building, thrumming through the stones. Something about it. There was a tone to that sound, as if it was a part of a song Takenda knew. "Down," Davriel said, turning and leading the way toward the stairs into the catacombs. They reached the stone steps, a hollow tunneling down into the earth. The shape of it, from the landing, looked reminiscent of the way the mouths of the spirits had twisted when screaming. "I inspected the sealing stone soon after arriving in this land," Davriel said, starting down the steps. "I recognized the wards it had on it, but I sensed no well of power as you describe, Miss Farleason. Still, I believe you must be right on some points. The bog entity sought a host in you after being threatened over time by the Church's expansion here. But as it was split by the birth of twins, the entity was not complete and therefore cannot communicate with you. The entities can affect one's senses, however, which could alone be the explanation for why you are sometimes blind. Perhaps it is trying, and failing, to override your vision as a way to communicate. I cannot explain why the loss would be so regular." "How do you know so much about it?" Takenda asked. "Let's just say I have encountered a similar circumstance myself," he said. He trailed off, stopping in the stairwell, cocking his head. Takenda looked up, past the two demons. Whispers. She could hear them echoing above, soft but haunting. The Geists had entered the priory. Davriel continued downward, and Takenda gave chase, holding up her candle and shielding it with her hand from the wind of their quick descent. "Our focus must be on your talents," Davriel said. "Though shrouded in superstition, there is likely a seed of truth in the stories your people tell of this nameless angel. I can only assume that I missed something about that stone." They reached the catacombs, and Davriel opened the door without needing to be told where to push. He turned right, following the winding path toward the room with the sealing stone. Soon, Takenda spotted its glowing walls and ceiling, lighting the way. They stepped into the room where the stone lay, undisturbed, on its pedestal. Someone else sat at the back of the room, staring at the stone with its swirling colors, a young woman with golden hair and pale skin. Willia. And with that cliffhanger, we will end it for this week. I am so glad that you could join me or watch this video later on YouTube, whichever one works. That last chapter was very long, way longer than the previous two. So, thank you once again for watching / listening in, and I will see you next week.